In August of 1590, Governor John White stood in his abandoned colony reading the message his colonists left behind. One word, carved clean into a post: Croatoan, no distress cross above it, a destination, not a cry for help. But White's own journal holds a second clue, and it has tormented historians ever since. Before he left, the colonists were preparing to move 50 miles into the mainland. Croatoan is an island 50 miles south. The mainland lies 50 miles west. One colony, two clues, two directions. For 4 centuries, every theory picked one clue and threw the other away. That was the mistake. The colony split in two. Archaeologists have now found both trails. This is the whole story. To understand why the colony split, you have to understand something the ghost stories always leave out. Roanoke was not a peaceful settlement that mysteriously vanished. It was a colony born into a war, and the war started before the colonists ever arrived. Go back to 1584. 2 English ships scout the outer banks of what is now North Carolina, searching for a place to plant England's first permanent colony in America. First contact is friendly. The English are welcomed to a village on Roanoke Island, and when the scouts sail home, 2 native men sail with them. Remember their names, because everything that follows runs through these 2 men. Wanchese of Roanoke, and Manteo of the neighboring island of Croatoan. They crossed the same ocean, saw the same England, and reached opposite conclusions. Wanchese came home convinced the English were invaders. Manteo came home fascinated and became their closest ally. One friendship and one enmity, and the fate of 115 people would eventually hang on the difference. In 1585, the first colony arrived. Roughly 100 men under Governor Ralph Lane, a military outpost, not a settlement. Almost nothing went right. The flagship struck a shoal in the treacherous inlets, and seawater spoiled most of the provisions. The promised resupply from England never came. So the colonists leaned on the food stores of their native hosts season after season, and the generosity strained, then cracked. And beneath the hunger, something far worse was moving. Everywhere the English visited, native people began to collapse and die. The local explanation was that the strangers could kill from a distance with invisible bullets, and they were closer to the truth than anyone knew. The English carried pathogens the native population had never met, and an epidemic tore through the villages without either side understanding why. Suspicion hardened on both sides. The chief, Wingina, pulled his people off the island entirely. Lane became convinced an attack was coming. And in June of 1586, Lane struck first. He led his men to the mainland village and massacred its people. Wingina himself was run down and beheaded, and his head was impaled outside the colony's fort. Whatever relationship had existed between English and native on that coast died on that day. A week later, Sir Francis Drake's fleet happened past, and the starving, embattled colonists abandoned Roanoke and sailed home. In the rush, 3 men could not be found in time. The fleet left without them. They were never heard from again. Shortly after, a passing English fleet, finding the colony empty, left 15 crewmen behind to hold the claim. Hold that image. A burned alliance, a beheaded chief, a coalition of enemies led by Wanchese, the man who had seen England and rejected it. 3 men abandoned, 15 men holding a fort at the edge of the world. That is the true condition of Roanoke Island in 1587, the year the story everyone knows actually begins. Because that summer, 115 fresh colonists crossed the Atlantic. Not soldiers this time, families, women, children. A pregnant woman named Eleanor Dare, daughter of the new governor, John White. And they were sailing, without knowing it, into a war that had already started. Here is the detail that changes how you read everything that follows. The 1587 colony was never supposed to be on Roanoke at all. The plan was the Chesapeake Bay, 50 miles and more to the north. Deeper water for large ships, fertile soil, open land, and critically, distance from an island soaked in the previous colony's sins. The new settlement even had a name waiting, the city of Raleigh. The colonists were meant to stop at Roanoke only briefly, to collect the 15 crewmen holding the fort, and then sail on. They never sailed on. The fleet's navigator was a Portuguese pilot named Simão Fernandes, a veteran of the earlier voyages, and by most readings, the man the crew actually obeyed. White held the title of governor, Fernandes held the ship, and when the colonists went ashore at Roanoke, Fernandes simply refused to carry them further. The reasons are still argued. What matters is the result. 115 men, women, and children were dumped on the one island in America where the English name was already hated. The omens began immediately. Of the 15 crewmen they had come to collect, they found nothing but a scattering of bones, the remains of one man. The rest were gone. Days later, a colonist named George Howe waded out alone to catch crabs in the shallows. A group of natives found him there. They put 16 arrows into him and broke his skull with a wooden club, and they left him where he fell for the colony to find. The message required no translation. The English were not welcome on Roanoke. Through Manteo, the colonists learned what had happened. A coalition of mainland tribes, led by Wanchese himself, had attacked the 15 crewmen. At least 2 died. The rest fled in a small boat and vanished from history. So take stock of the colony's position in its first weeks. The wrong island. A hostile coalition across the water, led by a man with a grievance and a memory. And exactly one friendly door left on that entire coastline, the island of Croatoan, Manteo's home, its people still bound to the English through him. That alliance was reaffirmed and made formal that same August. It was the single asset the colony had, and every survivor on Roanoke knew it. That same month, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, the governor's granddaughter. And almost immediately after the christening, the colonists came to White with a demand. The colony could not survive as provisioned. Someone with standing had to return to England and bring back supplies, reinforcements, a future. That someone had to be the governor. White resisted. He feared being branded a deserter, and he feared leaving his daughter and newborn granddaughter on that precarious island more than he feared any accusation. The colonists insisted. And in late August of 1587, John White boarded a ship and watched Roanoke shrink behind him, carrying a promise to return within the year. He would not see that coastline again for 3 years. Because White sailed home into the path of the Spanish Armada, and England slammed its ports shut. And while an empire fought for its life, the ground under his colonists was quietly beginning to fail. While White paced the docks of a country under embargo, the colonists faced an enemy no ship could have warned them about. Centuries later, scientists read it in the trees. Ancient bald cypress trees in the region hold a ring for every year of their lives, wide rings for wet years, narrow rings for dry ones. And the rings covering the late 1580s record a severe drought gripping that coast, striking at precisely the years the colonists stood alone. Crops shrivel in a drought. Fresh water turns scarce. Game thins out. And the native communities who might once have absorbed hungry neighbors were fighting for their own harvests. The colony's food problem was no longer a supply problem. It was a landscape problem. Now sit where the colonists sat, somewhere in that window after the first year passed with no sail on the horizon. The governor has not returned. England, for all they know, has forgotten them or fallen. Staying on Roanoke means sandy soil, failing water, and Wanchese's coalition across the Sound. Staying is dying slowly. So they must move. And when they open that question, there are exactly 2 destinations on the table, because both had been on the table from the beginning. The first is the mainland interior, roughly 50 miles west, toward the fertile ground at the head of the Sound. White himself recorded that intention in his journal, that the colony was preparing to move 50 miles into the main. That was the plan for a real permanent settlement, farmland, fresh water, distance from enemies. The second is Croatoan, 50 miles south, Manteo's Island, the one place on that coast where the English name still opened doors instead of closing them. Here is the problem. The 2 destinations solve 2 different problems. The mainland solves farming and water and safety in depth, but it abandons the coast, and the coast is where a returning governor will look. Croatoan solves the alliance and keeps watch on the sea lanes, but a small sandy island in a drought cannot feed 100 and more extra mouths for years. Each destination alone is a gamble. Both together are a strategy. Split the colony, send the main body inland to ground that can actually sustain them, exactly as planned. Send a smaller party to Croatoan to live under the protection of the alliance, watch the water, and serve as the living forwarding address for the governor. And then carve the agreed signal into the post with no cross, because this is not a flight, it is a plan, executed in good order. Read the 2 clues again with that in mind. The carving says Croatoan. The journal says 50 miles into the main. For 400 years, those 2 clues were treated as a contradiction, and every theory had to throw one of them away. They were never a contradiction. They were both true at once, 2 halves of one decision recorded in 2 different places. 1 colony, 2 destinations. For 4 centuries, that remained a theory, elegant and unprovable, resting on a carving and a sentence. Then, in the 21st century, 2 separate archaeological teams began digging 50 miles apart, one to the west, one to the south. And both of them struck English evidence. Follow the Western Trail first, because it begins not in the dirt, but on paper. In the British Museum sits a watercolor map of the Carolina coast called La Virginia Pars, painted by John White himself, one of the finest artists of his age. Scholars studied it for centuries and noticed 2 small paper patches glued to its surface. Nobody cared. Mapmakers patched their corrections all the time. In 2012, researchers finally examined what was underneath. Under the first patch, exactly what you would expect. A minor correction. Under the second patch, at the point where 2 rivers meet 50 miles inland from Roanoke, was a fort. A 4-pointed star, the standard symbol of a 16th century fortification drawn in paint matching the rest of the map, which means drawn by White's own hand and then covered by White's own hand. And there was more. On top of that patch, drawn in a substance that behaves like invisible ink and can barely be seen with the naked eye, is a second, smaller fort symbol. Hiding in plain sight for 4 centuries, a correction does not need concealing. A secret does. And the secret matches the sentence in White's journal, word for word. 50 miles into the main. Why hide it? Because England's enemies read England's maps. When John Smith later sent a map of Virginia home from Jamestown, the Spanish ambassador secretly copied it and passed it to the King of Spain. Spanish patrols were hunting English settlements on that coast with orders to erase them. A marked fort was a death warrant, and White knew it. So the destination was encrypted into the artwork itself. That is the plan on paper. Now the ground. Guided by the hidden fort, the First Colony Foundation began excavating a quiet stretch of Bertie County, North Carolina, near the meeting of those 2 rivers, at a spot they codenamed Site X. The soil produced English pottery, not trade goods, not fine porcelain, but rough, utilitarian household ceramics, including a distinctive greenish glaze type called Surrey Hampshire border ware, made in Elizabethan England, the dishes English families cooked and ate from. And alongside what the diggers found sits what they did not find, and the absence is the sharper blade, not one clay tobacco pipe. From Jamestown in 1607 onward, English sites are littered with broken white pipe stems so reliably that archaeologists use them as a calendar. English artifacts with 0 pipes means English occupation before Jamestown existed. In that place, at that time, only one group of English people fits. The skeptics answered, fairly, that one site could be an anomaly, a camp, a handful of men passing through. Then the Foundation confirmed Site Y, a second, distinct Elizabethan site in the same region, and published the excavation data with the University of North Carolina Press. 1 site is an accident, 2 is a movement. Be honest about the limit, because the limit matters. Nothing at Site X or Site Y carries a colonist's name. What the dirt proves is Elizabethan English households living inland at the planned coordinates at the right time. The Western Trail, confirmed. But the carving on the post pointed the other way. And on an island 50 miles south, a second team had been digging every summer since 2009. The southern trail runs to Hatteras Island, the long ribbon of sand of the 16th century called Croatoan. And this trail was not opened by one lucky find. It was opened by stubbornness. Since 2009, archaeologist Mark Horton and the Croatoan Archaeological Society, founded by island native Scott Dawson, have excavated the old Croatoan village sites around Buxton and Frisco year after year, building on groundwork laid in the 1990s by archaeologist David Phelps at a site called Cape Creek. And season by season, the island began handing up objects that had no business in a purely native village. A 10-carat gold signet ring engraved with a prancing lion, believed to date to the 16th century. A small piece of slate used as a writing tablet, found together with a lead pencil. Sit with that one. Somebody in that Croatoan village could write. A Nuremberg token, pulled from the ground in 2013, with clean stratified provenance confirming it to the 16th century, matching nearly identical tokens found on Roanoke Island itself. The same rare objects on both islands in the same era. And lead shot lodged in a deer bone, ammunition that could only be there because a European fired it on Hatteras at the time of contact. Now, the honest objection, because every one of those finds has one. Rings can be traded, tokens can be gifted, a slate can be carried by a passing visitor. Objects move. Objects prove contact, not residence. Which is exactly why the next discovery changes the entire case. The excavators uncovered massive amounts of hammerscale, tiny flakes of metal that exist in only one place on Earth, the ground beside a blacksmith's forge. Heat an iron rod, strike it with a hammer, and microscopic slivers spray off and pile up at the smith's feet. 2 large piles of those iron flakes, and here is the decisive part, found stratified underneath layers that date to the late 16th or early 17th century. Understand what hammerscale means, because the logic is airtight in a way almost nothing in archaeology ever is. You cannot trade hammerscale, you cannot gift it, carry it, or lose it out of a pocket. It is not an object at all. It is industrial residue, generated on the spot, and only where a working forge stood. And a forge is not a campsite. A forge means anvils, bellows, furnaces, permanence. Iron working technology was no part of indigenous practice in that region. Trade explains objects. Nothing but residence explains a forge. English hands were working English iron inside a Croatoan community in the Elizabethan layer of the ground. Horton's conclusion is that the colonists assimilated into the native community and that their sons, granddaughters, and grandsons carried on living on Hatteras Island into the early 1700s. And that date matters, because in 1701, the explorer John Lawson visited that same island, and the Hatteras people told him something remarkable. Some of their ancestors, they said, had been white and could read from books. Several of them, Lawson noted, had gray eyes, found in no other tribe he knew. The ground and the testimony agree, 3 centuries apart. 2 trails, 2 teams, 1 colony, time to rule on it. So let us lay out the full case, exhibit by exhibit, the way a courtroom would. Exhibit 1, the 2 clues themselves. A carving pointing south to Croatoan, left calm and deliberate, with no distress cross. A journal entry pointing west, 50 miles into the main. Contemporaneous, contradictory only if you insist there was one destination. Exhibit 2, the map. A fort symbol at the western coordinates, drawn by White's own hand, hidden under a patch by White's own hand, with a second symbol in near invisible ink on top. Corrections are not concealed. Plans are. Exhibit 3, the western dig. Elizabethan household pottery at Site X, sealed in time by the total absence of Jamestown-era tobacco pipes, then confirmed by a second site, Site Y, in the same region. English families, inland, before 1607. Exhibit 4, the southern dig. A signet ring, a writing slate, a stratified 16th century token matching Roanoke's, lead shot in a deer bone, and above all, the hammerscale industrial residue that cannot travel, proving a working English forge inside a Croatoan village. Exhibit 5, the testimony. In 1701, the Hatteras people told John Lawson their ancestors were white and could read, and Lawson saw the gray eyes himself. In Exhibit 6, the motive clock. Tree rings recording a severe drought at precisely the years the colonists stood alone, the pressure that forced the move. 6 independent lines of evidence, none depends on the others, and everyone is explained by a single event, a planned division. Now honesty demands the caveats, and they are real. No artifact from either trail carries a colonist's name. No grave has been matched to the 1587 manifest. Some scholars maintain the finds could still reflect trade or later contact, and say the case will stay open until it produces something no market can move. And the excavators themselves disagree about proportions. Scott Dawson, who has spent his life digging on Hatteras, argues the entire colony went to Croatoan and never split at all. The First Colony Foundation's inland pottery argues otherwise. The split model is not a compromise between them. It is the only reading that explains both evidence sets and both of White's clues without throwing anything away. Science rules by weight of evidence, and the weight says the colony was never lost. It was divided, relocated, and absorbed. So run the story once, clean, the way the ground tells it. A colony dumped on the wrong island, inheriting a war it did not start. A governor forced home, then trapped by an armada. A drought closing around 115 people. A decision made in good order, not in panic. The main body inland, to the marked ground at the meeting of 2 rivers. A party south, to Manteo's people, to keep the alliance and watch the sea. A word carved on a post, a plan hidden on a map. Years of waiting that outlasted the waiting. Then marriages, children, forges, and 2 English trails, slowly dissolving into the country itself. The 3 promises from the start of this story are paid. The war explains the leaving. The patch preserves the plan. And the forge proves the arrival. The colony did not vanish in one direction. It survived in 2. The mystery survived 4 centuries because we kept demanding one answer to a 2-part question. The colonists were never a single lost thing, waiting in one place to be found. They were families making the oldest choice in survival. Split the risk. One trail leads into the Carolina interior, one onto an island in the Atlantic, and both end the same way, in kitchens, in marriages, in children who belonged to 2 worlds. The 2 clues White left us were both true. Everyone just kept choosing between them. 115 people did not vanish. They multiplied, and their trails waited in the dirt for anyone willing to follow both. If you want the next investigation, subscribe. See you in the next exploration.